The afternoon heat settles gently over Bauru. Along the narrow streets, the earth is dry enough to rise in little clouds beneath the bare feet of children, weaving between the houses, chasing one another through the dust, and inventing games with older broom handles their parents had reluctantly agreed to spare. Laundry hangs between modest homes, stirring only when the occasional breeze finds it. Somewhere nearby, the faint sound of a radio drifts through an open window, its voices softened by distance and the weight of the afternoon heat. A boy walks alone, with a small bundle tucked beneath one arm. It's not quite a ball, not the kind most children would recognise today. This makeshift ball has been made from old socks, rolled and packed until it holds its shape. Firm enough to kick, soft enough to control with the foot. Precious, because it's been made by his hands. Every now and then, the boy lets it drop to the ground and nudges it forward with the side of his foot, guiding it past stones, doorways, sleeping dogs, and the uneven patches of road that he knows by heart. He passes neighbours who have known his family for years. The ambient noise of the city becomes more intimate as he passes each household. He can hear pots and pans being moved in kitchens, the clink of cups, the low murmur of adults talking through open doorways of houses. The city around him is modest and inland, far from the beaches and bright postcards that many envisage Brazil to be. He pauses near one house where several voices have gathered around a radio. Football commentary spills out into the street, bringing a fresh energy that breaks the stale afternoon air. It wraps around him quicker than he can quite register. The adults lean towards the small metal box. For a moment, the boy stands still, listening, with the handmade ball resting beneath one foot. Before he realises it, he's playing out every moment inside his head. He follows each movement, fluid and sharp, visualising the intricate passes between unknown players, how they run, the speed, the cheers, the sweat. The commentator's voice rises, followed by a roar from the crowd that distorts the tiny speaker. He carries on towards a patch of open ground where the dust had already been marked by other feet. He drops the ball. This time, he does not kick it away, but rather lifts it with the top of his foot gently, once, twice, a final and third time. The movement is small and almost private, as naturally intimate as breathing. The afternoon sun grows warmer on his shoulders when a bird calls out from somewhere above the rooftops, gesturing him to look at the sky. Welcome to Sleepy Archives, a space where we drift through the people, places, and stories that have helped shape the world as we know it today. Tonight, we drift through the life of Pelé, tracing the path from a small town in Brazil to becoming one of the most celebrated athletes in history. So, however you're listening, take a moment to get comfortable, and let's begin. When Edson Arantes do Nascimento, or Pelé as we would later know him, was born on the 23rd of October 1940, the world was already deep in the uncertainty of the Second World War. Although Brazil had not yet formally entered the conflict, life was changing. News travelled across the Atlantic by newspaper and radio, while conversations about shortages, politics, and the future drifted into the homes and cafes across the country. Yet for many families, living far from Brazil's largest cities, daily life remained centered on work, family, and community. Edson was born in the small town of Tres Corações in the southeastern state of Minas Gerais. Its name translates to the Three Hearts, inspired by the meeting of three nearby rivers. Surrounded by rolling hills, farmland, and railways, it was a place where people often knew one another by name, and where the rhythm of the day was shaped less by clocks than by the arrival of trains, church bells, and the changing light. His parents were João Ramos do Nascimento and Celeste Arantes. Like so many Brazilian families of the time, they worked hard to build a stable home despite having little in the way of material wealth. João, known almost to everyone as Dondinho, had grown up with an extraordinary love for football. Tall, athletic, and naturally gifted, he played as a centre forward for several local clubs, earning admiration for his ability on the pitch. Friends and teammates often remarked that his headers were among the finest they had ever seen. As in much of the rest of the world, football offered moments of joy and possibility. But in Brazil, during the 30s and 40s, even talented players rarely enjoyed financial security. Many balanced training sessions with ordinary jobs, working long days before changing into football boots for weekend matches. For Dondinho, football was never simply a game. It was a language through which friendships were built, communities gathered, and ambitions quietly took shape. Although he dreamed of achieving more in the sport, an injury to his knee limited the career he had once imagined for himself. Like countless promising athletes whose names never appeared in the newspapers beyond their own region, he accepted the disappointment and continued providing for his growing family in whatever way he could. Celeste offered something different. Where Dondinho was often remembered for his warmth and enthusiasm, she was practical and quietly determined. She valued education, stability, and hard work, believing these would offer her children opportunities that talent alone could never. Throughout Edson's childhood, she would become a steady influence, encouraging responsibility while protecting the close-knit home she and her husband were building. Although football would one day become inseparable from the family's story, it did not dominate their early lives. Like many young couples raising children during the 40s, their days were filled with ordinary routines. There was work to be found, meals to prepare, clothes to wash, and a household to maintain. Their hopes were simple: enough food on the table, good health, and the chance for their children to grow up safely. Not long after Edson's birth, the family moved to the city of Bauru, in the state of São Paulo. The move was driven largely by the search for steadier work and better opportunity, and a decision shared by many Brazilian families during the period. As towns and cities continued to grow, it was here, amongst dusty streets and neighborhood football matches, that the little boy from the opening of our story would spend much of his childhood. The move to Bauru offered the family something they had been searching for: the possibility of a steadier future. The city was growing quickly. Its expanding railway connections created opportunities for work and trade. Streets that had once been little more than sketches of packed earth gradually welcomed families from nearby towns and rural communities, many drawn by the hope of finding stable employment and building a secure future for their children. For Edson, however, Bauru was simply home. Like countless children growing up in Brazil during the 40s, much of his childhood unfolded outdoors. The streets became football pitches, playgrounds, and meeting places all at once. Games were rarely organised, but instead, they appeared naturally as more children wandered outside after school or once the day's chores had been finished. Goalposts were marked with stones or discarded pieces of wood, and every uneven patch of ground became another part of the game. His parents had named him Edson after the American inventor Thomas Edison, although the spelling had quietly changed along the way. It was an unusual choice, reflecting a period when scientific progress and modern invention captured imaginations across the world. Yet within the neighborhood, he was simply another young boy with scraped knees and an endless desire to play. Money remained tight. Like many children of the time, Edson contributed where he could, shining shoes around the city to earn a few extra coins. He learned to approach strangers politely, offering his services and taking pride in the job. The small income helped the family, but it also taught him something that stayed with him throughout his life. Opportunities were rarely handed to anyone. More often, they had to be created. Football was simply a normal part of these ordinary days. Don Genio rarely treated his son like a future star, but instead, he encouraged him to enjoy the game itself. Together, they practiced controlling the ball, improving balance, and learning how every touch could shape what happened next. Years later, Pelé would often speak about these early lessons, remembering that his father valued intelligence on the pitch just as much as natural ability. As evening settled over Bauru, neighbours would gather around radios to follow matches being played hundreds of miles away. Before television became common in Brazilian households, football existed first as sound. The rise and fall of a commentator's voice and the roar of distant crowds captured the imagination of each listener, and it created a match that was slightly different in each household. In 1950, when Brazil hosted the FIFA World Cup, the excitement spread across the country. There was a growing belief that the national team would finally lift the trophy on home soil. Instead, before almost 200,000 spectators inside the newly built Maracanã Stadium, Uruguay defeated Brazil 2-1 in the decisive final match of the tournament, a result that would become known simply as the Maracanazo. Among the millions of listeners was Don Genio. Years later, Pelé recalled seeing his father in tears after the final whistle. It was one of the very few times he remembered seeing him cry. According to Pelé's own recollection, he wrapped his arms around his father and quietly said, "Don't worry, I'll win the World Cup for you one day." Whether those exact words were spoken precisely as memory later recalled, the moment remained deeply significant in Pelé's life. For a young boy watching the disappointment of a nation through the eyes of his father, football became something larger than a game. It became hope, identity, and a dream that would quietly shape everything that followed. As Edson grew older, the game that had simply once filled his long afternoons began to take on a different rhythm. Friends noticed he could keep the ball close with seemingly little effort. Adults passing by would occasionally stop for a moment longer than they had intended, watching as a slight boy darted around on the uneven ground. Even so, football remained only one part of his childhood. There were still errands to run, school to attend, and shoes to shine around the streets of Bauru. His mother, Celeste, remained determined that education should not be forgotten, while Don Genio quietly encouraged his son's growing love of the game without allowing it to become an obsession. One of the greatest influences on Edson's development came through futsal, a fast-paced version of football often played indoors on a much smaller court with fewer players and a smaller, heavier ball. There was little room to hide and even less time to think. Every touch demanded precision. Every touch demanded precision, and every pass required quick judgment. In those crowded spaces where the ball rarely stopped moving, young players learned to rely on balance and awareness as much as speed. Years later, many coaches and teammates would point to those early futsal matches as an important part of what made Pelé such a complete footballer. The close control that seemed almost impossible on a full-sized pitch had first been developed in the confined spaces of indoor courts, where losing possession of the ball often meant losing in an instant. Back at home, Don Genio became his son's first and most patient teacher. Their practice sessions rarely resembled formal training. Instead, football found its way naturally into everyday life. A quiet moment after work, or a spare half hour before supper. Perhaps a walk home that became an opportunity to pass a ball between one another beneath the warm Brazilian sky. Don Genio encouraged Edson to use both feet with equal confidence, to keep his head raised whenever possible, and to think about where the ball should go before it had even reached him. They were simple lessons, quietly repeated over the years, but they would remain with him throughout his career. Around this time, another change quietly entered his life. Children at school had begun calling him Pelé. Exactly where the nickname came from has never been entirely clear. Pelé himself gave different explanations over the years, and even, he admitted, he never liked it as a boy. The most widely repeated story suggests it began after he mispronounced the name of Pelé, a local goalkeeper whom he'd admired. His classmates soon found the mistake amusing and continued teasing him with the altered name until it stuck. Whether that version is entirely accurate or not, the nickname gradually replaced Edson in the playground long before it appeared in the newspapers around the world. By the time Edson reached his early teenage years, his ability had begun attracting the attention beyond the neighborhood of Bauru. Local clubs had begun to notice his composure, his instinct for the game, and the ease with which he seemed to control the ball. Those who watched him often struggled to explain exactly what made him different. It wasn't his speed or his strength. There was a calmness to the way he played, as though he could already see the next move before anyone else. Among those who recognized his potential was Valdemar de Brito, a former Brazilian international player whose own career had earned him considerable respect. After retiring from the game, he turned his attention to coaching and developing younger talent. Years of experience had taught him to distinguish youthful promise from genuine, exceptional ability, and when he watched Edson play, he believed he had discovered something exceptionally rare. Don Genio had always encouraged his son's football, but he also understood how uncertain the path could be. His own career had shown him that talent alone was never a guarantee of success. Even the finest players could see their ambitions changed by injury, circumstance, or simple bad fortune. Because of this, there was little sense of rushing towards the future. The family remained grounded, continuing much as they always had, while Edson quietly improved in his own time. Valdemar, however, thought differently. Convinced that the young teenager deserved an opportunity beyond Bauru, he offered to take Edson to the coastal city of Santos, where Santos Football Club had developed a reputation for nurturing gifted young players. Santos lay hundreds of kilometers from home, on Brazil's southeastern coast, a world away from the streets where Edson had spent his childhood. For a family with limited financial means, the decision carried enormous weight. Sending a 15-year-old away from home was no small decision. It meant trusting another adult with their son's future, accepting uncertainty, and believing that the opportunities waiting beyond Bauru were worth the sacrifice of watching him grow up from a distance. Accounts differ slightly in the finer details of those conversations, but there is little doubt that the decision was emotional. Celeste, practical as ever, worried about her son leaving home so early. Don Genio understood both the excitement and the risk more deeply than anyone else. Between them stood a quiet teenager who had spent years chasing a handmade ball through dusty streets. Now, he was being asked to imagine a life he had scarcely allowed himself to dream about. Eventually, the decision was made. Edson packed what little he needed and prepared to leave the city that had shaped almost every memory of his childhood. The railway lines that had once brought his family to Bauru would now carry him towards a future no one could fully predict. The train pulled away. The familiar streets slowly disappeared from view. Ahead lay Santos, a professional football club, and the beginning of a life that soon would belong not only to one family in Brazil, but to the entire world. When Edson arrived in Santos, everything felt unfamiliar. The streets were busier than those he had known. The sea, something he had rarely experienced growing up inland, now stretched beyond the city, bringing with it the scent of salt carried on the warm coastal air. Around him were older players, experienced coaches, and young footballers who had also travelled from across Brazil, each hoping to earn a place at Santos Football Club. Like many teenagers leaving home for the first time, Edson was homesick. He missed his parents and the familiar routines of family. The excitement of opportunity existed alongside this feeling, and much of his time was spent adapting to his new surroundings. Every player at Santos had already been among the most talented footballers in their own hometown. Now, they competed alongside one another every day, pushing each other to improve. Mistakes were noticed quickly, and progress had to be earned. Rather than shrinking beneath the pressure, Edson appeared to grow more comfortable with each passing week. Coaches were not only struck by his technical ability, but by the maturity of his decision-making. He rarely seemed rushed. While others chased the game, he often appeared to understand where the space would open before it had appeared. Those qualities developed on the uneven streets of Bauru and the fast-paced futsal courts of his childhood. They now began to separate him from players several years older. In 1956, at just 15 years old, Edson signed his first professional contract with Santos. It marked the beginning of a relationship that would shape both the club and the history of football itself. For the teenager, however, it was another step forward. There were still training sessions to complete and experienced teammates to learn from. His senior debut followed later that year. Although still remarkably young, he quickly showed glimpses of the composure that had first caught Valdemir de Brito's attention. On the 7th of September 1956, he scored his first goal for Santos in a friendly game. He became the youngest goal scorer in the club's history at the time. Those inside the club had hoped that they had discovered a special player. Now they were beginning to believe it. Word spread steadily through Brazilian football circles. Coaches spoke about the teenager with unusual maturity. Opponents found themselves surprised by his confidence, and journalists began mentioning his name with increasing curiosity. Soon, the rest of Brazil would learn his name. By the summer of 1958, Edson was still only 17 years old. Although he had already begun to establish himself at Santos, few could have imagined how quickly his life was about to change. Brazil had named its squad for the 1958 FIFA World Cup, hosted in Sweden. The tournament brought together 16 nations from across the world, each hoping to lift football's greatest prize. For Brazil, the memories of the Maracanazo 8 years earlier remained painfully fresh. The disappointment of 1950 still lingered, and expectations were high once again. For Edson, even being considered was extraordinary. He was one of the youngest players in the entire competition, travelling thousands of miles from home to represent his country on the biggest stage football could offer. Yet the beginning of the tournament proved frustrating. A knee injury prevented him from taking part in Brazil's opening matches, forcing him to watch from the sidelines while his teammates began their World Cup campaign. Every footballer wants to contribute, particularly during the biggest competition of their career. For a teenager experiencing his first World Cup, the frustration was even greater. Training continued, while recovery became the priority. His first World Cup goal. It was also enough to send Brazil into the semi-finals. Any suggestion that the moment might overwhelm him quickly disappeared. Facing France, one of the tournament favourites, Edson produced one of the finest performances of his young career, scoring 3 goals as Brazil secured a 5-2 victory. At just 17 years old, he had become the youngest player ever to score a hat-trick in a men's FIFA World Cup. The final brought Brazil face-to-face with the host nation Sweden, inside the Rosunda in Solna. For many players, the occasion might have felt intimidating. However, for Edson, it seemed to become another opportunity to play the game that he loved since childhood. Brazil won 5-2, with Edson scoring twice. One of those goals delicately lifted the ball over a defender before volleying it into the net. And this would become one of the defining images of the tournament. When the final whistle sounded, Brazil had won the FIFA World Cup for the first time in its history. The teenager from Bauru, who only a few years earlier had been shining shoes and practicing with a handmade football, had become a world champion. After the 1958 World Cup, Pelé returned to Brazil as something more than a promising young footballer. He was still a teenager, still connected to Santos, still close to the family and the routines that had shaped him. But now, strangers knew his face. Newspapers followed his progress with greater attention. Supporters arrived hoping to see the boy who had scored twice in a World Cup final before he was old enough to turn 18. At Santos, life became noticeably busier. The club understood that Pelé was no longer simply a gifted young player within their squad. Increasingly, he was becoming one of the main attractions. People came not only to support Santos, but to watch Pelé play. Crowds grew larger. Journalists followed his progress more closely, and opponents began preparing for him with greater care. The Santos team also began travelling more widely too, carrying their young star across Brazil and beyond. In an era before football was broadcast as frequently as it is today, seeing Pelé in person became something rare and valuable. Crowds seemed fascinated by what this young man could do with a ball. A sudden turn, a lifted pass, a finish taken before the goalkeeper had time to settle. For Pelé, these years were both exciting and exhausting. He was still learning how to live as a young adult, while already being treated as a national symbol. Hotels, stadiums, railway stations and airport lounges became the daily rhythm of his life. The boy who had once walked through Bauru with a handmade ball beneath his arm was now travelling through countries where people waited simply to catch a glimpse of him. European clubs soon became interested too. By 1961, several of the biggest teams in the world were trying to bring him overseas. But Pelé had become too valuable to Brazil, not only as a footballer, but as a source of pride. Under President Zânio Quadros, The Brazilian government acted to keep him in the country, declaring him a national treasure and making it far more difficult for overseas clubs to sign him. It was an extraordinary position for any young player to occupy. Gradually, it became clear that his career no longer belonged entirely to him. It belonged to Santos, to the supporters, to the Brazilian public, and to a country still learning what it meant to have produced one of the most admired footballers in the world. Nonetheless, on the pitch, Pelé continued to make the game feel simple. He could pass, score, create, improvise, and read a match with a calmness that seemed entirely his own. What made him difficult to describe, though, was that no single quality could fully explain him. 4 years later, Brazil travelled to Chile for the 1962 FIFA World Cup. By now, at just 21 years old, he had become one of sport's biggest names, and much of Brazil's hopes rested once again on his shoulders. The tournament began brightly. Pelé scored, helping his country secure another important victory. Yet his campaign was unexpectedly cut short. During the following match against Czechoslovakia, he suffered a muscle injury that prevented him from taking any further part in the competition. For many players, such a setback might have been devastating. Pelé could only watch from the sidelines as his teammates continued the journey without him. Led by remarkable performances from Garrincha and the rest of the Brazilian squad, Brazil successfully defended their title, becoming the world champions once again for a second consecutive tournament. Although Pelé's contributions on the pitch had been limited by injury, he had still become a 2-time World Cup winner before his 22nd birthday. The 1966 World Cup in England promised another opportunity, but it proved to be one of the most difficult tournaments of his career. By now, opponents understood that stopping Pelé often meant stopping Brazil. Heavy tackles became a familiar part of the game, and during this tournament, repeated fouls left him carrying injuries from one match to the next, and Brazil were eliminated during the group stage. The experience left a lasting impression. Disappointed by the physical nature of the tournament and exhausted by years of expectation, Pelé even suggested that 1966 might be his last World Cup. Football, however, still had become a chapter waiting for him. In 1970, the World Cup travelled to Mexico, becoming the first tournament to be broadcast in colour to audiences around the world. Pelé, now 29, returned alongside one of the most celebrated Brazilian teams ever assembled. Players such as Jairzinho, Tostão, Rivelino, and Carlos Alberto combined technical brilliance with remarkable understanding and created a team that many still regard as one of the greatest in football history. Brazil reached the final against Italy, producing a performance that has now become part of sporting folklore. Pelé opened the scoring with a towering header before later helping to create one of the most celebrated goals ever recorded. A flowing move across the pitch ended with perfectly weighted passes. Ended with his perfectly weighted pass into the path of Carlos Alberto, whose powerful finish secured Brazil's 4th goal in a 4-1 victory. When the final whistle sounded, Pelé lifted the World Cup for a 3rd time. No player before him had ever achieved that feat, and more than half a century later, no player has equalled it. While Pelé's achievements continued to dominate newspaper headlines throughout the 60s, another life was unfolding alongside them. Away from the stadiums and the cheering, Edson was learning to navigate adulthood. Success had arrived with remarkable speed, bringing opportunities that few could have imagined during their childhood. Yet, many of the questions he faced were the same as those experienced by young adults everywhere: how to build a home, maintain close relationships, and create moments of ordinary life while living under extraordinary circumstance. By the middle of the decade, Pelé had met a woman by the name of Rosemary dos Reis Scholby, a psychology student from Santos. The couple married in 1966, at a time when Pelé's football career was demanding more of his time than ever. Public appearances, training sessions, domestic competitions, international tours, and commitments to the Brazilian national team often kept him away from home for long periods of time, and it left little opportunity for the couple to establish the routines of their new life together. Although Rosemary had not grown up expecting life in the public eye, marriage to Pelé quickly introduced her to the world of constant travel, photographers, and public attention. While he spent long periods away competing for Santos and Brazil, much of the responsibility for creating a stable family home naturally fell to her. Unlike her husband, whose work unfolded before enormous crowds, her role was largely private, and it centered on raising their young children and providing a sense of normality whenever Pelé was able to return home. Over the following years, they welcomed children into their family, and Pelé embraced fatherhood while continuing to balance one of the busiest sporting careers in the world. Their first child, Kelly Christina, was born a year after their marriage in 1967. 3 years later came their son, Edson Scholby do Nascimento, affectionately known as Edinho, followed by their daughter Jennifer in the late 70s. Becoming a father offered moments that existed entirely outside of the stadium. Years later, Pelé would often speak warmly about his children, describing fatherhood as one of the greatest joys in his life, even while acknowledging that the demands of his career often kept him away from home for longer than he would have wished. It was not always an easy balance to achieve. His profession required constant travel and months away from home. Pelé had already achieved more in football than many players could hope for in an entire lifetime. 3 World Cup victories had transformed him into one of the most recognizable athletes in the world, while his performances for Santos continued to draw enormous crowds wherever the club travelled. Yet beneath the celebrations and admiration, life had become a demanding routine that had remained largely unchanged for more than a decade. Much of each year was spent travelling. Santos regularly embarked on tours across South America, Europe, Africa, and North America, playing exhibition matches that introduced millions of people to Brazilian football. For many supporters, these games offered the only opportunity they would ever have to watch Pelé play in person. Stadiums filled long before kick-off, and newspapers often treated the club's arrival as a significant event in and of itself. Travelling also exposed Pelé to cultures he had never imagined as a child in Bauru. He met heads of state, actors, musicians, and athletes from every corner of the world, yet his teammates often remarked that he remained entirely approachable. Whether speaking to presidents or children waiting outside of a stadium, he possessed an ease that helped people feel like they were meeting Edson as much as Pelé. That warmth became one of the reasons he was admired beyond his extraordinary ability on the pitch. The schedule remained relentless, and days were measured by training sessions, hotel rooms, and matches played before unfamiliar crowds. Between those commitments were interviews, photographs, public appearances. He made the decision to retire from international football. After 71 appearances for Brazil, it was a decision that surprised many supporters, but Pelé believed the time had come to allow for a new generation of players to carry the national team forward. His farewell match, played against Yugoslavia at the Maracana Stadium was marked by a long applause from the crowd and an atmosphere that reflected the gratitude many Brazilians felt towards the man who had helped redefine their country's place in the world of football. Throughout those years, Dondinho remained a constant in Edson's life. Pelé often reflected that many of the lessons that had shaped his career had not come from famous coaches, but from those quiet afternoons spent passing a ball with his father. His mother, Celeste, also provided a grounding influence throughout his success. Although she had once hoped football would not become her son's future, she continued to remind him of the values she believed mattered most. Pelé remained at Santos, continuing to score goals and mentor young players. Increasingly, he found himself occupying a different role within the dressing room. He was no longer the gifted teenager who had arrived from Bauru. He had become one of football's most experienced figures, someone whose presence alone carried reassurance and authority. Away from the pitch, his public profile continued to expand. Invitations arrived from governments, charities, international organizations, all of them recognizing that Pelé's influence extended far beyond sport. Wherever he traveled, people wanted not only to celebrate the footballer. Wherever he traveled, people not only wanted to celebrate the footballer they had admired, but also the man behind the famous name. For the first time since leaving Bauru, however, another question was beginning to emerge. If the world already knew Pelé, what might come after football? By the early 70s, Pelé had begun thinking more seriously about life beyond professional football. Although he had continued playing for Santos, the demands of nearly 2 decades at the highest level of professional football had begun to take its toll. His body had absorbed thousands of tackles. Countless flights and a relentless schedule of matches had left him tired and longing for a little more stability. At the same time, financial responsibilities continued to grow. Like many professional athletes of his generation, Pelé had earned significant sums during his career, but opportunities to build long-term financial security were very different from those available to elite sports people today. In 1974, after almost 19 years with Santos, Pelé announced his retirement from the football club. For many supporters, it seemed the end of one of the greatest playing careers the sport had ever known. Yet retirement proved shorter than almost anyone expected. Across the Atlantic, football was searching for a place in the American sporting landscape. Baseball, American football, and basketball dominated newspaper headlines, while association football remained a relatively unfamiliar game to much of the country. The New York Cosmos believed that one extraordinary player might help change that. After months of discussion, Pelé agreed to join the club in 1975. The announcement attracted worldwide attention. Newspapers far beyond the sports pages reported the move, recognizing that it represented far more than a transfer between football clubs. The move also meant the beginning of a new chapter for his young family. Rosemary and their children joined him as they adjusted to life in New York, exchanging the familiar routines for Santos. The move also meant the beginning of a new chapter for his young family. Rosemary and their children joined him as they adjusted to life in New York. It also meant the beginning of a new chapter for his young family. Rosemary and their children joined him as they adjusted to life in New York, exchanging the familiar routines of Santos for one of the busiest cities in the world. It was an exciting transition, but not necessarily an easy one. Pelé's commitments extended far beyond training and matches, and although the family were now sharing the same city, football continued to dictate much. Pelé was bringing the world's most popular sport into one of the world's largest media markets, carrying with him decades of admiration earned across every continent. Life in New York offered a striking contrast to everything he had known growing up in Bauru. Towering buildings replaced modest streets. Yellow taxis steamed across avenues that remained busy long after dark. And football stadiums sat alongside theatres, concert halls, and a city alive with figures from entertainment, politics, and business. Before long, Pelé found himself moving comfortably through these circles, and these circles included musicians, actors, artists, and world leaders. He became as familiar on magazine covers as he was on the pages of sporting outlets. His debut attracted an audience that reflected the extraordinary cultural significance of this move. Despite the glamour surrounding his new life, his purpose remained remarkably straightforward. He wanted people to fall in love with football. Crowds began arriving in growing numbers, and many attended matches having never seen the sport played professionally before. Some came out of curiosity, and others simply because they had heard of the name Pelé. By the time they left, many had discovered a game that they would continue following long after his playing career had ended. For Pelé, New York became an opportunity to introduce the game that had shaped his own life to millions of people experiencing it for the first time. Away from the stadium, the family experienced a very different pace of life. Pelé's children began discovering New York through parks, museums, and busy streets filled with people from every corner of the world. For Edson, who had grown up in the modest neighborhoods of Bauru, there was something remarkable about watching his own children experience a childhood so different from his own. Pelé's time with the New York Cosmos came to an end in 1977. His farewell match was unlike any ordinary retirement fixture. It was played between Santos and the Cosmos, the two clubs that had defined his professional career, with Pelé playing one half for each side. The symbolism was unmistakable. One chapter of his life was closing, while another quietly began. As the years passed, Pelé found that retirement brought a different kind of purpose. Although the stadiums no longer formed the backdrop to his daily life, football continued to open doors to people and places he could have scarcely imagined as a child growing up. Invitations continued to arrive from around the world, asking him to speak and support charitable causes and lend his name to projects that reached far beyond sport itself. Throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, he travelled extensively as one of football's most recognisable ambassadors. Whether meeting school children, attending an international conference, or visiting communities where football was still developing, Pelé understood that many people saw him as more than a former player. To supporters, he represented the possibility that talent, determination, and opportunity could change the course of a life. His work increasingly reflected that responsibility. As a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador and through his involvement with UNICEF, Pelé supported initiatives promoting education, children's welfare, and improved access to sport. He believed football could offer more than entertainment. It could encourage confidence, create friendships, and provide young people with opportunities that might otherwise have remained out of reach. In Brazil, his influence continued beyond the pitch. During his time as Minister for Extraordinary Sport, he supported reforms intended to modernize Brazilian football and improve protections for professional players. Many of those proposals later became associated with the Pelé Law, legislation that sought to create greater transparency within the game while strengthening the rights of athletes. Although opinions differed on some of the aspects of the reform, few questioned his desire to leave the sport in a healthier position for future generations. Recognition continued to arrive throughout his later life too. Universities awarded him honorary degrees, and governments presented him with national honours and sporting organisations celebrating the remarkable achievements of his playing career. Yet those who met him often remarked less on the trophies than on his warmth. He remained generous with his time and autograph. Even after decades in the public eye, he seemed to understand that for many people, meeting Pelé would become a memory they carried for the rest of their lives. Perhaps that was because he never entirely forgot what it had felt like to be a young boy standing beside a radio in Bauru. The distance between those two lives was almost immeasurable, yet in interviews he frequently returned to his childhood, speaking with affection about his parents, his neighbourhood, and the handmade ball that had first taught him to love the game. After bringing his playing career to a close, Pelé returned to Brazil carrying a lifetime of memories that had stretched far beyond the pitch. Although international travel remained a regular part of his work for many years to come, home once again became the country where his story had begun. The pace of life gradually became gentler. There were still interviews to give, charities to support, and fans hoping to meet him. But increasingly, time was measured by family gatherings, friendships, and the quiet routines that professional sport had once made so difficult to enjoy. As he entered his later years, Pelé began facing a series of health challenges. Multiple operations on his hip had affected his mobility. It made walking increasingly difficult, while later treatments for kidney stones and recurring infections brought about frequent visits to the hospital. Even so, whenever his health allowed, he continued with public appearances, and he was always greeted with the warmth reserved for someone whose achievements had become woven into the history of the game. In September 2021, doctors removed a tumour from his colon during routine medical examinations. Over the months that followed, he continued receiving treatment while remaining in close contact with his family. Messages of support arrived from every corner of the world, from former teammates, opponents, presidents and sporting organisations, and of course, floods of well wishes from supporters who had grown up watching him play or inherited his story from earlier generations. On the 29th of December 2022, Pelé passed away in São Paulo at the age of 82, surrounded by his family. News of his death travelled quickly across the world. Stadiums held a moment of silence, and buildings were illuminated in the green and yellow of the Brazilian flag. Tributes came from football, but also musicians, actors, political leaders, and ordinary people who had never forgotten the joy he had brought them. For many, it felt less like the passing of a footballer than the farewell to one of 20th century's greatest cultural figures. Perhaps the truest measure of Pelé's life cannot be found in the trophies he lifted or the records he set, but in the countless children who picked up a football because they heard his name. In every country he visited, every stadium he filled, and in every community where the game continued to grow, a small piece of the boy from Bauru travelled with him. And if we return for just a moment to those quiet streets where our story began, the afternoon feels much the same. The heat still settles over rooftops, and laundry is still drying between the modest homes. Somewhere, a radio continues to play through an open window and children chasing one another through the dust. It is easy to imagine one of them pausing for a moment, and children chase one another through the dust. It is easy to imagine one of those children pausing for a moment, a worn football resting beneath one foot, already picturing a future beyond the neighbourhood. Once, that child was called Edson Arantes do Nascimento. If you enjoyed this week's episode, we'd be so grateful if you left a review or a rating on your favourite podcast platform. It really does help more people discover our show. You can also find us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Sleepy Archives Pod, where we share more moments and stories from the archives. Until next time, take care of yourselves, each other, and we'll meet you again in the archives.